The morning air in Portland, Oregon carried an unusual chill for late September. Sarah Mitchell sat in her Civic in the courthouse parking lot, staring at the imposing granite building that loomed before her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. In the backseat, 3-year-old Emma hummed softly to herself, oblivious to the anxiety radiating from her mother. "Mommy, are we going to the castle?" Emma asked, her bright blue eyes fixed on the towering federal courthouse with its columns and grand architecture. Sarah forced a smile into the mirror. "Something like that, sweetheart. Mommy has to talk to some people and you need to be very, very quiet. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded solemnly, clutching her stuffed bunny, Mr. Hoppers, against her chest. Sarah's heart ached. She'd never wanted to bring her daughter here to this place of judgment and legal proceedings, but her regular babysitter had called in sick at 6 that morning, and there was simply no one else. The court had made it clear, testify today or face contempt charges. Her former employer had stolen nearly $4 million from elderly investors, and Sarah's testimony about the documents she'd been forced to create was crucial to the prosecution's case. Taking a deep breath, Sarah unbuckled Emma from her car seat and lifted her out. The little girl felt so light, so fragile. Sarah smoothed down Emma's yellow dress, the one with the sunflowers that Emma had insisted on wearing because it was her brave dress. If only she knew how much bravery her mother needed right now. They walked hand in hand up the courthouse steps, Emma's small legs working double time to keep pace. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, and Sarah could already feel her anxiety spiking. She'd have to explain why she had a toddler with her, justify her presence, possibly face judgment from court officials who would wonder what kind of mother brings a child to a federal trial. The security officer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a bun, smiled warmly at Emma. "Well, hello there, sunshine. What's your name?" "Emma Rose Mitchell," Emma announced proudly just as Sarah had taught her. "I'm 3.5. 3.5? That's very grown up," the officer said, waving them through after a quick bag check. "You be good for your mama, okay?" Inside, the courthouse transformed into a cathedral of justice and intimidation. Marble floors stretched endlessly, their polished surfaces reflecting the fluorescent lights overhead. The ceiling soared at least 30 feet high, decorated with ornate molding that spoke of a different era. Every footstep echoed, every whispered conversation seemed amplified in the cavernous space. Men and women in expensive suits hurried past, their faces stern and focused, clutching leather briefcases and manila folders thick with documents. Emma's hand tightened in Sarah's grip. "Mommy, it's loud," she whispered, even though the space was filled only with the ambient noise of shuffling feet and hushed voices. "I know, baby. We'll sit down soon," Sarah promised, checking the directory board. "Courtroom 4B, 3rd floor." The elevator ride felt interminable. Emma pressed herself against Sarah's legs as two lawyers in navy suits discussed legal precedents in clipped, professional tones. Sarah could feel her daughter's heart beating rapidly through the thin fabric of her dress. Emma had been more anxious lately, clingy, prone to nightmares, resistant to being left alone even for a moment. The pediatrician had suggested it was a normal developmental phase, perhaps related to starting. Sarah had accepted that explanation, desperate to believe that nothing was seriously wrong. Courtroom 4B was already half full when they arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled start time. Sarah scanned the room, taking in the scene that would define her morning. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front, an imposing wooden structure that seemed designed to remind everyone who held the power here. The witness stand stood to its right, a simple chair in a small boxed area that suddenly looked terrifyingly exposed. Rows of benches filled the gallery, separated by a central aisle that divided the room like a river. Sarah chose a seat in the 4th row, hopping it was far enough back to be inconspicuous but close enough that she could hear when her name was called. She lifted Emma onto the bench beside her, and immediately pulled out the emergency entertainment kit she'd packed, a small coloring book, 4 crayons, and a juice box. "Remember, baby, you have to be really quiet. This is like the library," Sarah whispered, smoothing Emma's curls. 3 rows ahead, Detective Torres was already seated, reviewing notes for his own testimony in a separate case scheduled for later that afternoon. Beside him, lying with remarkable stillness on the floor, was Bailey, a 4-year-old golden retriever with a coat the color of honey and eyes that seemed to radiate warmth and intelligence. Bailey wore her official vest, marked with patches identifying her as a certified therapy dog working with the Portland Police Department's Victim Services Unit. Torres had been working with Bailey for 2 years, deploying her in situations where witnesses, particularly children and trauma survivors, needed emotional support during the difficult process of legal proceedings. Bailey had been present for over 60 cases, her calm demeanor and intuitive responses helping countless individuals find the strength to share their stories. As more people filtered into the courtroom, the energy shifted. Lawyers took their places at the prosecution and defense tables. A court reporter set up her stenography machine. The bailiff, a tall man with a military bearing, took his position near the judge's bench. Emma's coloring had already lost its appeal. She squirmed on the hard wooden bench, her legs swinging because they couldn't reach the floor. "Mommy, when do we leave?" she whispered. "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon," Sarah lied, knowing they might be here for hours. The bailiff's voice suddenly cut through the murmur of conversation. "All rise. The United States District Court for the District of Oregon is now in session, the Honorable Judge presiding." Everyone stood as Judge entered through a side door, her black robes flowing as she took her seat at the bench. Sarah felt Emma pressing against her side, confused by the sudden movement and formality. "You may be seated," Judge announced. The courtroom settled into a tense silence as the proceedings began. Sarah tried to focus on the opening statements, but her attention kept drifting to Emma, who was growing more restless by the minute. The little girl's hands trembled as she tried to hold a crayon, her breathing becoming slightly rapid and shallow. Sarah assumed it was just the overwhelming environment, the strange setting, the serious atmosphere, the presence of so many unfamiliar adults. She had no idea that Emma's reaction had nothing to do with the courtroom itself and everything to do with what her eyes had just locked onto across the aisle. Bailey, lying peacefully beside Detective Torres, completely unaware that she was about to change everything. Judge adjusted her reading glasses and shuffled through the documents before her, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd presided over federal cases for nearly 2 decades. "We'll begin with preliminary motions in the matter of United States versus. Counsel, are both parties ready to proceed?" The lead prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman in a charcoal suit, stood. "Yes, Your Honor, the prosecution is ready." The defense attorney, an older man with silver hair and an expensive watch that caught the light, rose as well. "Defense is ready, Your Honor." Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. She knew her testimony wouldn't come until after lunch, but the weight of what she was about to do, testify against a man who'd once been her mentor, who'd helped her get her first real job out of college, pressed down on her chest like a physical force. Sat at the defense table, his expression carefully neutral, but Sarah could feel his eyes on her. She'd avoided looking directly at him since entering the courtroom. Beside her, Emma had abandoned the coloring book entirely. The little girl sat unnaturally still, her body tense in a way that Sarah had begun to recognize over the past few weeks. It was the same rigid posture Emma adopted when Sarah tried to drop her off at Mrs., the same frozen quality that came over her daughter during thunderstorms, or when the house settled with unexpected creaks at night. "Emma, what's wrong?" Sarah whispered, leaning down close to her daughter's ear. Emma didn't respond. Her eyes had fixed on something across the aisle, 3 rows ahead. Sarah followed her daughter's gaze but saw nothing unusual, just the backs of heads, lawyers, courthouse staff, and detective tours with his therapy dog. The dog Bailey. Sarah had noticed the golden retriever when they'd first entered, had even thought how sweet it was that the courthouse provided therapy animals for people going through difficult proceedings. She'd read an article about it in the local paper months ago, how therapy dogs were helping trauma victims feel safe enough to testify, how their presence reduced anxiety and helped children in particular feel more comfortable in intimidating legal settings. But Emma wasn't looking at Bailey with the wonder and delight most 3-year-olds showed when they spotted a dog. There was something else in her daughter's expression, something that made Sarah's maternal instincts scream that danger was near. Judge was speaking about motions to suppress evidence when it happened. Emma's small body went completely rigid, every muscle locking simultaneously. Her breathing, already shallow, became rapid and panicked. And then, without any warning whatsoever, her right arm shot up into the air, finger extended, pointing directly across the courtroom aisle. That doggy! Emma's scream shattered the courtroom's formal atmosphere like a rock through glass. The sound was primal, terrified, nothing like the excited squeal of a child spotting a beloved animal. It was the cry of someone who'd seen a ghost, encountered a monster, come face to face with their worst nightmare. Every head in the courtroom swiveled. Judge's mouth opened mid-sentence. The prosecutor froze with her hand halfway to her briefcase, actually turned around to look. Detective Torres immediately sat up, his trained instincts kicking in. Bailey, for her part, simply raised her head with mild curiosity, her tail giving a single, gentle wag. But Emma wasn't finished. As every eye in the courtroom fixed on her, the little girl began backing away from the aisle, scrambling backward on the bench until she pressed against her mother's side. Her finger still pointed, shaking violently now, and tears began streaming down her flushed cheeks. "No, no, 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 no," Emma chanted, her voice rising in pitch with each repetition. "Not the doggy, not the doggy. Please, Mommy, not the doggy." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment and confusion. She grabbed Emma, pulling her daughter onto her lap, trying to physically contain the outburst. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," she called out, her voice cracking with mortification. "I'm so sorry. Emma, sweetheart, it's okay. It's just a dog. It's a nice dog." But Emma was inconsolable. She buried her face in Sarah's neck, her small body racked with sobs that seemed too large, too desperate for a simple fear of dogs. Sarah had never known her daughter to be afraid of animals. They'd visited petting zoos, walked past dogs in the park, even stopped to pet the neighbor's Labrador just last month. Emma had giggled and called it Fluffy and asked if they could get a puppy. This wasn't normal childhood fear. This was terror. Judge set down her papers, her expression shifting from irritation to concern. She'd seen a lot in her years on the bench: outbursts, breakdowns, theatrical performances from defendants and witnesses alike. But there was something about this child's genuine distress that gave her pause. "Bailiff, let's take a brief recess," she announced, her voice gentler than it had been moments before. 15 minutes. Clear the courtroom except for necessary personnel." The bailiff nodded. "All rise, court is in recess." The room erupted into motion. Lawyers gathered their materials, spectators filed out, and court staff began their recess routines. Sarah stood on shaking legs, still clutching Emma, who continued to sob against her shoulder. She could feel dozens of eyes on them, some sympathetic, some annoyed, some simply curious. "Ma'am, please step into the hall," the bailiff said quietly, his voice not unkind. "You can take a moment to calm your daughter." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She hurried toward the exit, Emma's cries echoing off the high ceilings. As she passed Detective Torres' row, she caught a glimpse of him watching them with an intensity that was different from the other observers. He wasn't looking at them with annoyance or curiosity. He was looking at them with recognition. In the hallway, Sarah found a wooden bench and sank onto it, still holding Emma. Other people from the courtroom filtered past, some glancing their way, most politely averting their eyes from the scene of a mother trying to console an hysterical child. "Emma, baby, please tell me what's wrong," Sarah pleaded, using the sleeve of her blazer to wipe her daughter's tear-stained face. "Talk to Mommy. What scared you?" Emma's sobs had subsided to hiccuping gasps. She pulled back just enough to look at her mother, and what Sarah saw in those blue eyes made her blood run cold. It wasn't just fear. It was recognition. It was memory. It was trauma. "The doggy," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. Like the doggy at the bad place." "What bad place, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, though something deep in her gut already knew, already suspected, already dreaded the answer. "Mrs. Doggy," Emma said, her chin trembling. "The big doggy in the basement, the one that watches us in the dark." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sarah's feet. Mrs. The place where Sarah dropped Emma off 3 mornings a week, the home run by a grandmother type with impeccable references and a warm smile, the facility that had a long waiting list because it was so highly recommended. The basement. The dark. A dog that watched. Sarah's hands began to shake. She'd noticed Emma's behavioral changes, the nightmares, the bedwetting, the clinginess, the fear of being alone. But she'd attributed them to normal developmental phases, to the adjustment of starting, to anything but what her mind was now screaming at her to consider. Before she could ask another question, a shadow fell across them. Sarah looked up to find Detective Torres standing there, Bailey sitting calmly at his side. The dog made no move toward them, simply sat and waited, as if she understood that she was the source of Emma's distress and was giving the child space. "Ma'am," Torres said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing 6'2" frame and the badge clipped to his belt. "I'm Detective Torres with the Portland Police Department. I couldn't help but notice your daughter's reaction in there." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've worked with traumatized children for a long time. That wasn't fear of dogs. That was something else entirely." Sarah looked down at Emma, then back up at the detective. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. She said something about a dog at her, in a basement, in the dark. Torres' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Sarah saw it. She saw the shift in his eyes from concern to something harder, more focused, professional. "Ma'am, I think we need to talk," he said, "and I think we need to talk right now." Bailey remained perfectly still, her brown eyes soft and patient, as if she knew that what happened in the next few minutes would change everything. For Emma, for Sarah, for children they'd never met, for a case that hadn't even begun yet. The pointed finger had been just the beginning. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at Detective Torres, trying to process what was happening. Just 30 minutes ago, her biggest worry had been getting through her testimony without breaking down. Now, sitting on a hard wooden bench in a courthouse hallway with her sobbing daughter in her arms, she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff she hadn't known existed. I don't understand," Sarah stammered, unconsciously pulling Emma closer. "Mrs. runs she's been doing it for 15 years. She has perfect reviews online. The state licensing board gave her a 5-star rating." Torres lowered himself onto the bench beside them, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Bailey moved with him, sitting at his feet but keeping her eyes fixed on Emma with an almost preternatural awareness. The dog seemed to understand that she was both the trigger and potentially the key to whatever was unfolding. "I'm sure she does have good reviews," Torres said carefully. "Most people who harm children are experts at appearing trustworthy. That's how they operate." He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "Can you tell me your daughter's full name and the name of the—" "Emma Rose Mitchell. She's 3.5, Sarah said automatically, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. "These little learners. It's a home on Maple Street, number 2847. Mrs. runs it out of her house." Torres wrote quickly, his handwriting sharp and efficient. "How long has Emma been attending?" 4 months, since May." Sarah's hands trembled as she stroked Emma's hair. The little girl had grown quieter, her sobs fading to occasional shuddering breaths, but she kept her face buried against her mother's shoulder, refusing to look at Bailey. She goes 3 mornings a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 8 to noon. And when did you start noticing behavioral changes? Sarah's breath caught. She'd been trying so hard to convince herself that Emma's recent struggles were normal, just a phase, nothing to worry about. But now, with a detective sitting beside her taking notes, those changes took on a sinister new significance. About 6 weeks ago, she admitted quietly, maybe early August, she started having nightmares, terrible ones where she'd wake up screaming. She began wetting the bed again, even though she'd been potty trained for over a year. She became clingy, didn't want me to leave her sight. Sarah's voice cracked. I took her to the pediatrician. Dr. Richardson said it was probably just adjustment anxiety from starting, that some kids take longer to settle in. She said to give it time. Tor's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Did Emma ever say she didn't want to go too? Did she resist drop-offs? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Yes, she whispered. God, yes. Every single time for the past month, she'd cry and beg me not to leave her there. But Mrs. said that was totally normal, that lots of kids go through separation anxiety. She said Emma was fine 10 minutes after I left, that she played with the other kids and ate her snacks and took her nap like everyone else. Did you ever see Emma during the day? Pick her up early unexpectedly? Sarah shook her head, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. No, I work downtown. I'm an accountant at an associate's. It's a 40-minute drive from the. Mrs. has a strict policy about pickup times. She says unexpected arrivals disrupt the children's routines. Tors wrote something in his notebook that Sarah couldn't see, then looked at Emma, who was still pressed against her mother like she was trying to disappear. Emma, he said gently, his voice dropping to a softer register. My name is. I'm a police officer, which means my job is to help people and keep them safe. Can you look at me for just a second? Emma slowly turned her head, her tear-stained face emerging from the shelter of Sarah's shoulder. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked at Tors with the wary expression of someone who'd learned not to trust adults easily. That's very brave, Tors said warmly. Thank you for looking at me. I want you to know that you're not in any trouble at all. In fact, you might have just done something really, really important by telling your mom about the doggy. Emma's lower lip trembled. I'm not supposed to tell. The words fell into the hallway like stones into still water, sending ripples of horror through Sarah's consciousness. What do you mean, baby? Who said you're not supposed to tell? Mrs., Emma whispered, her voice so small Sarah had to lean in to hear. She says what happens at stays at. She says if we tell our mommies and daddies about the basement time, the doggy will come to our houses at night and get us. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her arms tightened around Emma involuntarily, a primal maternal instinct to protect her child from a threat she was only beginning to understand. Oh my God, she breathed. Oh my God, Emma, why didn't you tell me? I was scared, Emma said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I was scared the doggy would come. Tor's professional composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of anger crossing his features before he controlled it. Sarah saw his hand clench around his pen hard enough that his knuckles turned white. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled. Emma, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Mrs. lied to you. Dogs can't come to houses on their own. They can't hurt you unless a person tells them to, and I promise you, I absolutely promise you, that dog is never going to come near you again. Do you believe me? Emma studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Good girl, Tors said. Now, I know this is scary to talk about, but can you tell me about the basement? What happens during basement time? Sarah wanted to stop this, wanted to tell Tors that her daughter had been through enough, that they should wait, that Emma needed time to process. But another part of her, the part that was beginning to realize something terrible had been happening to her child, needed to know. Needed to understand how she'd missed this, how she'd failed to protect her baby. Emma took a shaky breath, her small hand gripping the collar of Sarah's blouse. When there's too many kids, or when we're too loud, Mrs. gets angry. She says her head hurts and we need to have quiet time. She takes us downstairs to the basement. How many kids? Tors asked. Emma held up both hands, fingers spread wide, then added a few more fingers. Lots, more than I can count. Sarah's heart sank. Little Learners was licensed for a maximum of 6 children. If Emma was describing 10 or more, that meant Mrs. was running an illegal operation, taking in more children than she was authorized to care for, probably for extra money under the table. What's the basement like? Tors continued gently. Dark, Emma said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Really, really dark. There's only one little light and it's yellow and buzzy. The floor is cold and hard. There's a funny smell, like when Mommy forgets the towels in the washing machine. Damp, musty. Sarah felt sick. And the dog. Emma's whole body tensed. Big, black, with brown on his face and paws. He has a chain on his neck that's attached to the wall, but Mrs. says the chain is really long and if we make noise or try to open the door, he'll get us. She says he's trained to attack bad children. How long does she leave you down there? Forever, Emma said, the word carrying the weight of a child's distorted sense of time. We have to sit on the floor and be quiet. We can't talk. We can't cry. If we make noise, the doggy starts barking and growling and pulling on his chain, and it's so scary. Her voice rose with remembered panic. Tommy cried once because he missed his mommy and the doggy went crazy and Mrs. came down and yelled at all of us. She said if we couldn't be quiet, she'd let the doggy off his chain. Sarah couldn't stop the sob that escaped her throat. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to maintain some composure for Emma's sake, but the image of her daughter, her baby, sitting in a dark basement, terrified into silence by a guard dog, was more than she could bear. Who's Tommy? Tors asked, still writing rapidly. One of the other kids. There's Tommy and Madison and the twins, I don't know their names, and Sophie and some others. Sophie's little. She's only 2. She cries a lot, but she learned to cry quiet. Learned to cry quiet. The phrase echoed in Sarah's head. No child should have to learn to cry quietly. No child should have to be afraid of seeking comfort when they were scared or hurt or missing their parents. Tors flipped to a new page in his notebook. Emma, you're being so brave right now. I'm very proud of you for telling us about this. Can you remember the last time you were in the basement? Emma thought for a moment, her brow furrowing with concentration. Friday, 2 days ago. We were there for a long time because Mrs. had a headache and she told us she was going upstairs to sleep and we better not make a single sound. 2 days ago. Sarah had picked Emma up at noon on Friday, just like always. Mrs. had been cheerful and friendly, had told Sarah that Emma was doing wonderfully, making friends, eating all her snacks. She'd mentioned nothing about headaches or basements or children being left unsupervised with a guard dog. When you came upstairs, did Mrs. check on you, make sure you were okay? Emma shook her head. She was asleep on the couch. We had to wake her up when we heard parents coming to pick up. Tors closed his notebook and looked at Sarah. His expression was grim but determined. Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. What your daughter just described constitutes child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, and operating an illegal facility. Possibly more depending on what else we find. This is serious. What happens now? Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. Now I make some calls, Tors said, standing up. We need to get Child Protective Services involved immediately, and I need to contact the local precinct to send officers to residents. We'll need to interview the other children and their families, and we'll need a formal statement from Emma, but not today. Today, she's done enough. He looked down at Emma and his expression softened. Emma, you did exactly the right thing by telling your mom about the doggy. You helped us, and now we're going to help all the other kids. You're a hero." Emma didn't look like she felt like a hero. She looked exhausted and scared and very, very small. Bailey, who had been sitting patiently throughout the entire conversation, suddenly stood up and took one careful step toward Emma. The little girl tensed, but Bailey didn't come any closer. Instead, the golden retriever simply sat down again and offered one gentle wag of her tail as if to say, "I'm not that other dog. I'm safe." Emma stared at Bailey for a long moment. Then, in a voice so quiet Sarah almost missed it, she whispered, "Nice doggy." "Very nice doggy," Tors confirmed. "The nicest." And for the first time since the outburst in the courtroom, something that might have been the beginning of trust flickered in Emma's eyes. Detective Tors had been working in law enforcement for 23 years, 12 of those specifically in the Victim Services Unit. He'd seen things that haunted his dreams, heard stories that made him question humanity, and witnessed the aftermath of cruelty that most people couldn't imagine. But even after all those years, after all those cases, the sound of a child describing systemic abuse still made his blood run cold. He stepped away from Sarah and Emma, pulling out his phone as he moved down the hallway toward a quieter corner. His first call was to Child Protective Services. The line rang 3 times before a harried-sounding woman answered. "CPS, this is Jennifer Martin speaking." "Jennifer, this is Detective Tors, PPD Victim Services. I need an immediate emergency response team dispatched to 2847 Maple Street. We have credible allegations of child endangerment at a home, multiple victims, possible ongoing situation." There was a brief pause, then the sound of rapid typing. "Can you give me details?" Tors kept his voice low but urgent. "Licensed facility is authorized for 6 children maximum. Witness describes 10 to 12 children being confined in a basement with inadequate supervision and an aggressive guard dog. The operator is 1. I need eyes on that location within the hour." "Understood, I'm dispatching a team now. Will you be on scene?" "As soon as I can get there. I'm currently at the federal courthouse with a witness. One of the victims is 3 years old. I'll need to coordinate with the local precinct for immediate intervention." "Detective Tors, if there are children in immediate danger—" "I know," Tors interrupted. "That's why I'm calling you first. But it's Friday afternoon. If runs a normal schedule, most of the kids are probably already picked up for the day. We need to move fast but smart. I don't want to spook her into running or destroying evidence." "Agreed. I'll have my team do a welfare check under the guise of a routine inspection. We'll report back within the hour." Tors ended the call and immediately dialed the Portland Police non-emergency dispatch. While he had jurisdiction to investigate as part of Victim Services, he needed uniformed officers for the actual intervention. As he waited for the call to connect, he glanced back down the hallway at Sarah and Emma. The little girl had shifted slightly, no longer completely buried against her mother's shoulder. She was watching Bailey with a mixture of fear and curiosity, the natural inclination of a child who loved animals warring with the learned terror from weeks of psychological abuse. Bailey, for her part, remained perfectly still, demonstrating the patience she'd been trained for. The dog understood her job wasn't to approach or force interaction, but simply to exist as a safe presence, allowing traumatized individuals to come to her on their own terms. "Portland Police, how can I direct your call?" "This is Detective Tors, badge number 4782, Victim Services Unit. I need to speak with the watch commander immediately regarding an active child endangerment situation." "Transferring now." 30 seconds later, Sergeant Michael's gruff voice came on the line. "Tors, what you got?" Tors had worked with before, a no-nonsense 20-year veteran who'd started in patrol and worked his way up through sheer competence and dedication. If Tors needed someone who would take swift action without getting down in bureaucratic delays, was that person. I've got credible witness testimony from a 3-year-old victim describing systematic abuse at Little Learners, a home on Maple Street. Multiple children confined in a basement, unsupervised, with what sounds like a guard dog trained for aggression. The facility is over capacity, licensed for 6. Witness describes 10 to 12 kids. Jesus Christ muttered, "You at the scene?" Negative. I'm at the federal courthouse. Witness broke down during court proceedings. That's how this came to light. CPS is sending a team for a welfare check, but I think we need officers standing by. If gets wind of the investigation, she might destroy evidence or intimidate the other families. Agreed. I'll send 2 units to stage nearby plain clothes. What's your ETA? Torres checked his watch. 30 minutes. I need to get the witness and her daughter somewhere safe first, get preliminary statements documented. Copy that, keep me posted. Torres ended the call and made one more quick call, this time to his partner, Detective Lisa, who was technically off duty but who he knew would want to be involved in a case of this magnitude. Torres, this better be good. I'm at my kid's soccer game, answered, crowd noise audible in the background. How fast can you get to the office? We've got a major child abuse case breaking, multiple victims, home situation. The background noise immediately decreased as if had walked away from the field. I'm 20 minutes out. What do you need? I need you to set up an interview room, get the video equipment ready, and pull everything we have on licensed in the city. Specifically, I need the file on Little Learners on Maple Street. Operator. On it, how many victims are we talking about? Could be a dozen, maybe more. We're just starting to peel this back. I'll be there in 15, said All Business Now. And Torres, good catch. Torres hung up and stood for a moment, organizing his thoughts. The next few hours would be critical. They needed to secure the scene, ensure no children were currently in danger, interview witnesses, and build a case solid enough that couldn't slip through on technicalities. But more than that, they needed to do right by the victims, children who'd been terrorized into silence and who would need extensive support to overcome the trauma. He walked back to where Sarah and Emma waited. Sarah looked up at him with eyes full of desperate hope and desperate fear. The expression of a parent who just discovered their worst nightmare was real, but who was clinging to the possibility that someone could fix it. I've made the calls, Torres said, sitting back down on the bench. Child Protective Services is sending a team to check on the right now, and we have police officers coordinating for a full investigation. Mrs. Mitchell, I need you to understand that this is going to move quickly from here. What does that mean? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. It means that within the next few hours, we're going to need formal statements from both you and Emma. It means is likely going to be arrested and charged. It means every family with a child in that is going to be contacted and interviewed. It means this is going to become very big, very fast. Sarah nodded slowly, trying to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. What do we do right now? Right now, I need to ask Emma a few more questions, if that's okay. Nothing too intense. I just need to clarify some details while they're fresh. Then I'm going to take you both to our main office, where we have rooms specifically designed for interviewing children. My partner, Detective, specializes in working with young victims. She's excellent with kids. Torres turned his attention to Emma, who was watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. Emma, I need to ask you some more questions about Mrs. House. Is that okay? Emma looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. It's okay, baby. Detective Torres is helping us. Okay, Emma whispered. Can you tell me about the other rooms in Mrs. House? Where do you play when you're not in the basement? Emma's face brightened slightly at the shift to a less frightening topic. There's a big room with toys and books. It has a TV and a rug with the alphabet on it. That's where we have snack time and story time. What about outside? Is there a backyard? There's a fence and some grass, but we don't go out there very much. Mrs. says it's too much trouble to watch all of us outside. Tors made a mental note. If was keeping the children inside most of the time, that reduced the likelihood of neighbors noticing the overcapacity situation. What does Mrs. look like? Can you describe her? She's old. She has gray hair that's short and fluffy. She wears glasses with sparkly things on them. She has a big stomach and she always wears sweaters, even when it's hot. That's very good, Emma. You're very observant. Tors paused, considering his next question carefully. The dog in the basement, you said it was big and black with brown on its face. Did Mrs. ever tell you the dog's name? Emma's expression darkened again. She calls him. Sometimes she talks to him when she puts us in the basement. She says, "You watch these children and make sure they behave." And he starts growling. Sarah made a small, anguished sound. Tors reached out instinctively, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Mitchell, I know this is incredibly difficult to hear, but Emma's information is vital. Every detail helps us build a stronger case." "I just can't believe I didn't know," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face now. "I dropped my daughter off at that woman's house 3 times a week for 4 months, and I had no idea she was being tortured. What kind of mother does that make me?" "It makes you a normal mother who trusted someone with good references and official credentials," Tors said firmly. "Is a predator. Predators are experts at manipulation. They create facades of trustworthiness specifically to disarm parents' protective instincts. This is not your fault." Before Sarah could respond, Tors' phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from Jennifer Martin at CPS. "Team on scene. Multiple children present. Situation worse than described. Officers needed immediately." Tors' jaw tightened. He stood abruptly. "I need to go to the now. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to have an officer drive you and Emma to our main station. Wait for me there. Don't go home. Don't talk to anyone else about this yet. We need to control the flow of information until we've secured all the witnesses." "There are still children there?" Sarah asked, horrified. "Right now?" "It appears so," Tors said grimly. He looked down at Bailey and gave a subtle hand signal. The dog immediately stood, alert and ready. "Which means we need to move fast." He made a quick call, arranging for Officer Price, a 28-year-old patrol officer known for her excellent rapport with families, to escort Sarah and Emma to the station. While they waited for Price to arrive, Tors knelt down one more time in front of Emma. "Emma, you are one of the bravest people I've ever met," he said seriously. "What you did today, telling your mom about the basement, talking to me about what happened, that took real courage. Because of you, we're going to help all those other kids. Tommy and Madison and Sophie and all the others. They're going to be safe now because you were brave enough to speak up." Emma studied his face for a long moment, then looked at Bailey. "Is the nice doggy going to help them too?" Tors smiled, the first genuine smile since this nightmare had begun. "Yes, Bailey is going to help all of them just like she helped you." Emma reached out tentatively, and this time her small hand made contact with Bailey's soft golden fur. The dog remained perfectly still, allowing the child to touch her at her own pace. "Good doggy," Emma whispered. And in that moment, Tors knew they were going to break this case wide open. Officer Price arrived within minutes, a kind-faced woman with warm brown eyes and an immediate, natural way with children. She introduced herself to Sarah and Emma with a gentle smile that didn't feel forced or patronizing, then efficiently guided them toward an unmarked police vehicle parked in the courthouse lot. Tors watched them go, Sarah holding Emma's hand tightly, the little girl clutching Mr. Hopper's against her chest with her free arm. "Bailey, come," Tors commanded softly, and the golden retriever fell into step beside him as they headed for his own vehicle. The drive to Maple Street took 12 minutes through Friday afternoon traffic. Tors' mind raced through possibilities, protocols, and potential pitfalls. If CPS said the situation was worse than described, That could mean anything from more children than Emma had reported to active abuse in progress. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Bailey sat in the passenger seat, her specially designed harness keeping her secure. She seemed to sense her handler's tension, remaining alert but calm. Tors had worked with 4 different therapy dogs over his career, but Bailey was special. She had an almost supernatural ability to read human emotion, to know exactly when to approach and when to give space, when someone needed the comfort of physical contact, and when they needed the reassurance of simply knowing she was there. The house at 2847 Maple Street looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a charming single-story ranch home in a quiet residential neighborhood. The lawn was neatly trimmed, flower boxes adorned the windows, and a cheerful wooden sign hung by the front door reading "Little Learners," where every child blooms. A white picket fence enclosed the front yard. It was the picture of wholesome, trustworthy. Tors felt his stomach turn at the deception. 2 CPS vehicles were parked in the driveway, along with a patrol car that had arrived as backup. Sergeant stood on the front porch talking to a CPS supervisor Tors recognized, a veteran social worker with a reputation for being thorough and unflappable. Tors approached quickly, Bailey at his heel. "What's the situation?" His expression was grim. "We counted 14 children inside when we arrived. 14. The facility is licensed for 6. Tried to claim some were here for but 3 of the kids immediately told us they come here every day. We've got 2 in diapers who are severely neglected, rashes, dehydration. One 4-year-old with what looks like cigarette burns on his arm, though claims he burned himself on a curling iron." Tors' jaw clenched. "Where's now?" "Inside, attempting to be cooperative while also making excuses for everything. She's asking for her lawyer." Paused. "Detective, you need to see the basement. We haven't let her down there yet and she's been extremely resistant to allowing access." "Show me." Led Tors through the front door. The interior matched the exterior, clean, well-decorated, filled with educational posters and children's artwork. The main playroom Emma had described was to the right, where several frightened-looking children sat on the alphabet rug under the supervision of 2 CPS workers who were trying to keep them calm and occupied. Stood in the kitchen, a gray-haired woman in her mid-60s wearing a blue cardigan and sparkly glasses, exactly as Emma had described. She was speaking rapidly to another CPS worker, her voice carrying that particular tone of wounded innocence that Tors had heard 1,000 times from people who knew they were caught, but weren't ready to admit it. "I don't understand what this is about," was saying. "I run a perfectly legitimate. If there's been a complaint, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Some parents get upset when their children go through normal separation anxiety." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw Tors and Bailey. Something flickered across her face, fear, recognition, calculation, before she smoothed it into a confused smile. "Officer, I'm sure we can clear this all up. I've been running this for 15 years without a single incident." "Detective," Tors corrected coldly, "and we'll have plenty of time to talk. Right now I need access to your basement." Smile faltered. "The basement? There's nothing down there but storage. It's not part of the licensed space. I don't see why." "Ma'am, I can get a warrant in under an hour, or you can grant permission right now. Your choice." His hands twisted together. Of course you can look. I have nothing to hide. But I should tell you I do keep my dog down there. He's not aggressive, but he might bark at strangers." "Then I suggest you come down with us and control your animal," Tors said flatly. The basement door was located in the kitchen, a plain white door that unlocked with a key she pulled from her pocket. The fact that it was locked from the outside told Tors everything he needed to know. She flipped a light switch, and a dim yellow bulb, exactly as Emma had described, illuminated a set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. The smell hit Tors first, damp, musty, with underlying notes of urine and fear. He felt Bailey tense beside him, the dog's training warring with her natural instinct to react to the scent of distress. They descended the stairs, leading the way and calling out in a falsely cheerful voice, "Good boy, we have visitors." The basement was finished, but barely. Concrete floors, exposed beams in the ceiling, one small window near the top of the far wall that provided minimal natural light. And there, chained to a support beam with a heavy logging chain, was. The dog was massive, easily 90 pounds, a German Shepherd Rottweiler mix with a broad head and powerful jaw. His ears pinned back as they entered, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. The chain attached to his collar was at least 15 feet long, giving him range to cover most of the basement. Tors noted immediately that there were no food or water bowls visible, no bed or comfort items. This wasn't a pet. This was a weapon. But what made Tors' blood run cold was everything else in the basement. Against one wall, a row of small blankets were spread on the concrete floor, thin, inadequate things that wouldn't provide any real warmth or comfort. A single bucket sat in the corner, and Tors didn't need to inspect it closely to know it was being used as a makeshift toilet. There were tiny handprints on the walls at child height, smudged and desperate. And scattered across the floor were small personal items, a pink hair clip, a small toy car, a child's sock. "How long do you keep them down here?" Tors asked, his voice deadly calm. His facade was cracking. It's just for nap time. Some of the children need a quiet space." "How long?" "An hour, maybe 2. Just when I need a break, when they're too loud, when my head hurts." "You leave children, some as young as 2 years old, locked in this basement in the dark, guarded by an aggressive dog, for hours at a time while you nap upstairs." It wasn't a question. Silence was answer enough. Tors turned to, "Get her out of here. I want photographs of everything before anything is moved, and I want animal control here to take custody of that dog." "You can't take," protested. "He's my property. He's never actually hurt anyone." "He's evidence in a child abuse case." Tors cut her off. "Sergeant, please escort Ms. upstairs and read her rights. She's under arrest for child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, operating an illegal facility, and animal abuse." As Leda, now protesting, back up the stairs, Tors stood in that basement and felt the weight of what had been happening here. 14 children cycling through this space, some of them probably multiple times a week for months, taught to be silent through terror, taught that crying brought punishment, taught that no one would help them. Except Emma had helped them. Emma had seen Bailey and broken through the fear enough to tell the truth. Tors looked down at Bailey, who was standing rigidly beside him, every muscle tense. The therapy dog was trained to remain calm in difficult situations, but even she seemed affected by the oppressive atmosphere of the basement. "Good girl," Tors murmured, running his hand along her back. "Let's get out of here." Back upstairs, organized chaos had taken over. More CPS workers had arrived to help process the children. Parents were being called, though Tors had instructed that only minimal information be shared until they could coordinate proper interviews. The children who'd been in the playroom were being gently questioned, medical evaluations arranged for those showing signs of physical harm. Tors pulled aside. "I need contact information for every family. We'll need to interview all the children, preferably with therapy dog support. Some of them are going to be as traumatized as Emma, maybe more so depending on how long they've been coming here." "Already compiling the list," confirmed. "Detective, I've been doing this job for 18 years. I've seen some terrible things, but the calculated nature of this, using an animal to terrorize children into compliance, this is a special kind of evil." Tors nodded grimly. "How many do you think knew what was happening and couldn't tell their parents?" "Based on the fear responses we're seeing, most of them, maybe all of them." Over the next 2 hours, as crime scene investigators photographed the basement and collected evidence, as animal control carefully removed from the property, as parents arrived in various states of shock and denial and rage, Tors coordinated the massive undertaking of processing 14 victims and their families. His phone rang constantly, detective calling with updates from the station where Emma and Sarah were waiting, the district attorney's office wanting preliminary information to begin building charges, the police chief asking for a briefing, local news stations somehow already getting wind of the story. But through it all, Tors kept thinking about that moment in the courthouse hallway when Emma had first touched Bailey's fur. The exact second when a traumatized child had decided that maybe, just maybe, she could trust again. That not all dogs were monsters. That not all adults would hurt her. That speaking up might actually lead to help instead of punishment. Bailey had given Emma that gift, the gift of feeling safe enough to tell the truth. And now, Tors realized, they needed to give that same gift to 13 other children who were still carrying the weight of secrets they'd been too terrified to share. He looked down at Bailey, who gazed back at him with those knowing brown eyes. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us, girl," he said softly. Bailey's tail wagged once, a gesture of readiness and purpose. They would help these children heal, one gentle moment at a time. Just as Bailey had helped Emma transform her pointed finger of fear into a pointed finger of justice. By 7 o'clock that evening, the story had broken across every major news outlet in Portland. Tors sat in the police station's conference room, surrounded by case files, witness statements, and half-empty coffee cups, watching the 10 o'clock news preview flash across the muted television mounted on the wall. Breaking news. Local owner arrested in massive child abuse case, scrolled across the bottom of the screen in stark red letters. His phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time. This time it was the mayor's office. He let it go to voicemail. Detective Lisa sat across from him, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her usually warm features drawn with exhaustion and anger. She'd spent the past 4 hours conducting preliminary interviews with 6 of the families, and the toll was visible in the tight lines around her mouth. "The twins," she said, sliding a file across the table to Tors. 4 years old, been attendings for 7 months. Their mother, Jennifer, had no idea about the basement. None. She thought her boys were getting premium care, educational activities, socialization, healthy meals. She paid $200 a week per child under the table because told her the official rate didn't include the enhanced curriculum. Tors opened the file, Scanning's detailed notes. "Let me guess, there was no enhanced curriculum. Unless you count being locked in a basement with a guard dog as educational." His voice was bitter. The twins finally broke down and told their mother everything about an hour ago. They've been having basement time, an average of 3 times a week since March. One of them, Tyler, has been having night terrors so severe that his mother had him scheduled for a sleep study next month. She thought it was a neurological problem. "Jesus," Tors muttered, rubbing his eyes. "How many of the families are we through?" 6 out of 14. And Tors, every single one is the same story. Behavioral changes that parents attributed to normal development or minor issues. Nightmares, bedwetting, anxiety, aggression, withdrawal. One little girl, Sophie, the 2-year-old Emma mentioned, has been pulling out her own hair. Her parents thought it was a phase. Tors felt the familiar weight of these cases settling on his shoulders. Every child abuse investigation carried its own particular horror, but there was something especially insidious about this one. Had been operating in plain sight, with glowing reviews and proper licensing, while systematically terrorizing children into silence. "What about the physical evidence?" he asked. Flipped open another file. Crime scene techs found DNA evidence from at least 12 different children in that basement. Hair, skin cells, saliva on the blankets. They found urine stains on the concrete floor that indicate the bucket was overflowing regularly. There are scratch marks on the inside of the basement door, little finger marks, Tors, children trying to get out. She pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. Tors looked at it and felt his stomach turn. It showed the inside of the basement door, and she was right. There were dozens of small scratches in the wood, concentrated at heights between 2 and 4 feet off the ground. The desperate marks of children who'd been locked in the dark. The dog, Tors asked. Animal control has in quarantine. Their behavioral specialist did a preliminary assessment. The dog shows signs of training for protective aggression. Basically, he was taught to bark and growl on command to appear threatening. But here's the thing. The specialist says is actually terrified. He's been abused too. Kept in that basement 24/7, inadequate food and water, no socialization or exercise. Used him as a weapon, but she was abusing him in the process. Tors shook his head. The layers of cruelty just kept unfolding. So she was torturing an animal to torture children. What's the DA saying about charges? They're still building the case, but we're looking at multiple counts of child endangerment, one for each child, unlawful imprisonment, operating an illegal facility, animal abuse, possibly fraud for taking payments for services she wasn't providing. Paused. The DA wants this airtight. Tors' lawyer is already making noise about how she's a grandmother, a pillar of the community, how this is all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Blown out of proportion, Tors' voice rose with incredulity. We have 14 victims, we have physical evidence, we have. I know, cut him off. I know, but her lawyer is going to argue that the children are unreliable witnesses, that their parents are coaching them, that the basement time was just a quiet rest period that he's already claiming was just a pet dog who happened to be kept in the basement for convenience. Tors stood abruptly, packing to the window. Outside, the Portland skyline glittered in the evening darkness. Somewhere out there were 14 families whose worlds had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours. Children who were finally safe but who would carry the scars of this trauma for years, maybe forever. We need the children's testimony on record, he said finally. Proper forensic interviews conducted by specialists with everything documented, and we need Bailey there for as many of them as possible. Agreed. I've already contacted the Children's Advocacy Center. They can start interviews tomorrow, but Tors, it's going to take weeks to get through everyone properly. And some of these kids are so young, the 2-year-old, a couple of 3-year-olds, their testimony might not be admissible in court. Then we build the case on the older children and the physical evidence, Tors said firmly. Emma is 3.5. She's articulate, detailed, consistent. If we can get even 3 or 4 other children who can corroborate her account. His phone rang again. This time it was the front desk. He answered with a curt, Tors. Detective, we have a situation down here. There's a woman demanding to see you. Says her name is Maria and her daughter attendance. She's pretty upset, and she has her daughter with her, a 5-year-old named Isabella. The girl is saying she wants to talk to the man with the nice doggy. Tors exchanged a glance with, send them up to interview room 3. I'll be right there. 5 minutes later, Tors entered the interview room with Bailey at his side. Maria was a petite woman in her early 30s, wearing nurse's scrubs and looking like she'd been crying for hours. Beside her sat a small girl with long dark hair and enormous brown eyes that were fixed on Bailey with a mixture of hope and fear. Mrs., I'm Detective Tors. This is my partner, Detective. Isabella saw the news, Maria said, her voice shaking. She saw his picture on TV and she broke down. She started screaming, crying, saying things about a basement and a scary dog. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. She only went to that for 2 months last year, and I thought. Last year, Tors sat down carefully, keeping his voice gentle. Your daughter hasn't been attending recently. No, we moved to a different neighborhood in July of last year, and I found a closer to our new house. But Isabella went from May to July of 2024. And now she's telling me things that, Maria's voice broke. She's telling me things I can't believe I missed. Tors looked at the little girl. At 5, Isabella was older than most of the current victims, and if she'd attended over a year ago, that meant this pattern of abuse had been going on for at least that long. possibly much longer. "Isabella," Torres said softly, "do you remember me from the news?" The girl nodded, still watching Bailey. "That's my friend Bailey. She's a very special dog who helps children feel safe. Would you like to pet her?" Isabella looked at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. The girl reached out tentatively, and Bailey moved closer, placing her head under the child's small hand. "Bailey would never hurt anyone," Torres continued. "She's the opposite of scary dogs, do you understand?" "Mrs. Dog was scary," Isabella whispered. "I know. Can you tell me about Mrs. Dog?" Over the next 30 minutes, Isabella described experiences nearly identical to what Emma and the other children had reported. The basement, the darkness, on his chain, the terror of being left there while napped or watched television upstairs. She described other children she remembered from her time there, some of whom Torres recognized from the current victim list, which meant they'd been enduring this abuse for over a year. "Why didn't you tell your mommy?" Torres asked gently. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. said if we told, would find us. She said he could smell us anywhere, and he would come to our houses at night and hurt our families. She said the police wouldn't believe kids anyway, that grown-ups always believe other grown-ups." Maria made a strangled sound, pressing her hand to her mouth. "Isabella, Mrs. lied to you," Torres said firmly. "Dogs can't find people that way, is never going to hurt anyone ever again. And I believe you. Detective believes you. Your mommy believes you. You were very brave to tell us the truth." By the time Maria and Isabella left an hour later, with Isabella hugging Bailey goodbye and promising to come back for a formal interview, Torres, and both understood that this case was far bigger than they'd initially realized. "If's been doing this for over a year, possibly multiple years," said slowly. "There could be dozens more victims. Kids who aged out of, families who moved away, children whose parents still have no idea what happened to them." Torres nodded grimly. "We need to put out a public call for anyone who's ever used services, and we need to prepare for this to get a lot bigger before it gets smaller." By midnight, Torres' team had identified 6 additional families from past client lists who needed to be contacted. The local news had run the story as their lead piece, and the station's tip line was flooded with calls. Social media had erupted with parents sharing stories, comparing notes, realizing in horror that symptoms they dismissed might have been signs of abuse. Torres sat alone in his office, Bailey asleep on her bed in the corner, and compiled his preliminary report for the DA. 14 confirmed current victims, 1 confirmed past victim, potentially dozens more, physical evidence, witness testimony, a pattern of systematic abuse spanning at least 18 months, possibly years. All because one 3-year-old girl had pointed at a therapy dog in a courtroom, and for the first time in months, felt safe enough to tell the truth. His computer pinged with an email from the Children's Advocacy Center. They'd cleared their schedule for the next 2 weeks to prioritize case interviews. They were requesting Bailey's presence for every single interview with children under 6. Torres looked at the sleeping dog and felt a wave of gratitude for whatever instinct or training or innate goodness made Bailey so perfect for this work. She didn't understand the legal complexities, the media attention, the political pressure. She just understood that scared children needed gentleness, patience, and the reassuring presence of someone who would never, ever hurt them. "You're going to be busy, girl," he said softly. Bailey's tail thumped once against her bed, even in sleep. The investigation had exploded far beyond anything Torres had anticipated when he'd first approached Sarah and Emma in that courthouse hallway. But he was ready, they were all ready. Because 14 children, and counting, deserved justice. And they were going to get it. 3 weeks after that fateful Friday in the courthouse, Sarah Mitchell sat in the waiting room of the Children's Advocacy Center, watching Emma color a picture of a golden retriever. The drawing was the 4th one Emma had created that week, each one showing Bailey with increasingly elaborate details, surrounded by hearts and flowers and smiley faces. The transformation in her daughter over the past 21 days had been remarkable and heartbreaking in equal measure. Some days, Emma seemed almost back to her old self, laughing, playing, sleeping through the night. Other days, she would regress suddenly, curling into a ball at the slightest loud noise, refusing to let Sarah out of her sight, waking up screaming from nightmares about dark basements and growling dogs. Doctor, the child psychologist who'd been working with Emma, called it nonlinear healing. She'd explained that trauma recovery wasn't a straight path forward, but rather a winding road with advances and setbacks, good days and difficult ones. What mattered, she said, was that Emma was finally processing what had happened to her instead of burying it in silence. Mrs. Mitchell, a soft voice interrupted Sarah's thoughts. Torres, no relation to Detective Torres, though Sarah had made that mistake the first time they'd met, stood in the doorway. She was the lead child trauma therapist at the center, a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and an endless supply of patience. "We're ready for Emma's group session." Emma looked up from her drawing and her face immediately brightened. "Is Bailey here?" "She certainly is," smiled. "She's been waiting for you." Emma jumped up eagerly, grabbing her mother's hand. The fear that used to accompany any mention of dogs had been gradually replaced by genuine excitement at the prospect of seeing Bailey. It was one of the most visible signs of Emma's healing, this reclamation of her natural childhood love of animals that had tried to destroy. They walked down a cheerfully decorated hallway lined with children's artwork and motivational posters. The Children's Advocacy Center had been specially designed for young trauma victims, with soft lighting, comfortable furniture, and none of the institutional coldness of a typical government building. Every detail was meant to help children feel safe. The group therapy room was large and inviting, with colorful floor cushions arranged in a circle, shelves full of toys and art supplies, and huge windows that let in natural light. 6 other children were already there with their parents: Tommy, the 4-year-old boy Emma had mentioned; Madison Park, a 3-year-old with dark curls; the twins, Tyler and Sophie, the tiny 2-year-old who was still largely nonverbal; and Williams, a 5-year-old who'd been one of his victims for nearly 2 years. And in the center of the room, lying peacefully on a soft blue mat, was Bailey. Detective Torres sat nearby, not leading the session but present as Bailey's handler and as a reassuring connection for the children who'd come to trust him. He'd been at every single one of these group sessions, watching as scared, traumatized children slowly learned to feel safe again. Emma ran straight to Bailey, dropping to her knees beside the therapy dog. "Hi, Bailey, I made you a picture." She held up the crayon drawing proudly. Bailey's tail wagged and she leaned into Emma's hug. One by one, the other children joined them, creating a small circle of kids around the golden retriever. Even Sophie, who rarely engaged with anyone, crawled closer and placed one tiny hand on Bailey's back. Began the session with their usual opening ritual, each child sharing one thing they were feeling. It had taken weeks to get to this point, where the children felt comfortable expressing emotions instead of hiding them. "I'm feeling happy because I got to play at the park yesterday," Madison said shyly, "and I wasn't scared of the big kids." "I'm feeling mad," Tyler announced, "because I had a bad dream last night about the basement, and I'm mad that Mrs. was mean." "It's okay to feel mad," validated gently. "Mrs. did mean things. Being angry about that makes sense." "I'm feeling brave," Emma said, her hand still resting on Bailey's fur, "because I told the truth and it helped my friends." Torres felt his throat tighten. He'd heard variations of this statement from Emma several times now, but it never got easier. This 3-year-old child had somehow found the courage to break through her fear, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what her bravery had accomplished. The session continued with a combination of play therapy and structured activities designed to help the children process their trauma. They drew pictures of safe places and brave moments. They played with dolls and action figures, acting out scenarios where children told trusted adults about problems and received help. They practiced body safety, rules, and learned that their feelings mattered, that they had the right to say no, that adults who truly cared about them would listen and protect them. Bailey moved among the children like a gentle spirit, seeming to sense who needed her attention most at any given moment. When started to cry while talking about being scared in the dark, Bailey walked over and laid her head in his lap. When became agitated during a discussion about nightmares, Bailey positioned herself beside the girl, providing a warm, solid presence that helped ground her. Doctor, who was co-facilitating with, explained to the parents observing from the side of the room, "What Bailey provides is something we call co-regulation. The children are learning to regulate their own emotions by being near someone, in this case, a dog, who is consistently calm and safe. Bailey's heartbeat, her steady breathing, her predictable responses, all of these things help the children's nervous systems remember what safety feels like." Sarah watched her daughter laughing as Bailey gently took a toy from Emma's hand and brought it back, and she felt tears streaming down her face. This was the little girl she remembered from before, playful, confident, joyful. She was still in there, still fighting to emerge from the shadows of trauma. After the 90-minute session ended, Tors approached Sarah while Emma was helping put away toys with the other children. "How's she doing at home?" he asked. "Better," Sarah said honestly. "Still having rough nights sometimes, but they're getting less frequent. She started asking about going back to preschool, a real preschool this time, one I've thoroughly vetted." She smiled weakly. "I think I called 15 references and did 3 surprise visits before I even considered enrolling her." "That's not paranoia," Tors assured her. "That's being an informed parent. And for what it's worth, the changes we're pushing for in state oversight, mandatory cameras, unannounced inspections, stricter licensing requirements, a lot of that is happening because of Emma, because you came forward." Sarah nodded, still watching her daughter. "Detective Tors, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think they'll ever fully get over this, these children?" Tors was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I think trauma leaves marks," he said finally. "But I also think children are incredibly resilient. With the right support, the right therapy, the right love, they can heal. They can thrive. What happened to them will always be part of their story, but it doesn't have to be the whole story." Across the room, Emma was showing Bailey's picture to Tommy, explaining in serious tones how she'd drawn each paw carefully to make sure they looked real. Tommy was nodding appreciatively, offering his own artistic critique. "The DA called me yesterday," Sarah said quietly. "The trial is scheduled for January. They said Emma will probably have to testify." Tors had been expecting this. "We'll prepare her as much as possible. The courtroom will be closed to everyone except necessary personnel. She can have Bailey with her on the witness stand. We'll do a courthouse tour beforehand so it's not scary, and she'll have you there every step of the way." "What if it's too much for her? What if testifying re-traumatizes her?" "That's a valid concern," Tors acknowledged. "But Emma is already doing the hardest work, facing her fear, telling her story, processing her trauma. Testifying is just telling that same story one more time in a different setting. And this time, she'll know she's believed. She'll know she's protected. She'll know that speaking up leads to justice." Over the next several weeks, the group therapy sessions continued. Slowly but surely, the children began to heal. They learned that they weren't alone, that what happened to them wasn't their fault, that the scary dog couldn't hurt them anymore. They learned that adults could be trustworthy, that speaking up was brave, that their voices mattered. The parents formed their own support group, meeting separately to process their own trauma, the guilt of not knowing, the rage at, the fear for their children's futures. They shared resources, recommendations for therapists, strategies for handling nightmares and behavioral challenges. Detective had expanded the investigation and identified 23 additional families whose children had attended over the past 4 years. Not all of them had been subjected to the basement treatment, but enough had that the victim count now stood at 27 children. 27 small voices that had been silenced by fear and manipulation. Remained in custody, her bail set at $500,000 after the judge deemed her a flight risk. Her lawyer continued to maintain her innocence, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Physical evidence from the basement. The dog trained to terrorize. Testimony from nearly 30 children, many of whose accounts were remarkably consistent despite having no contact with each other. The media coverage had been intense but largely sympathetic to the victims. Several local news stations had run special segments on recognizing signs of child abuse, on the importance of therapy dogs in trauma recovery, on reforms needed in oversight. And through it all, Bailey had been there. Bailey, who had sat patiently through dozens of hours of testimony and therapy sessions. Bailey, who had comforted crying children and celebrated with happy ones. Bailey, who had somehow known exactly what Emma needed when she'd pointed that shaking finger in the courtroom and screamed in terror. As Torres watched Emma giggling while trying to teach Bailey to shake hands for the 20th time, he thought about the randomness of it all. If he hadn't been in that courthouse that day, if Emma hadn't seen Bailey, if the little girl hadn't found the courage to break her silence, how many more months would have continued? How many more children would have been traumatized? But Emma had seen Bailey. Emma had told the truth, and now 27 children were on the path to healing. Torres knelt down beside Emma. "You know what, kiddo? I think Bailey has something special planned for you." Emma's eyes widened. "Really, what?" Torres reached into his pocket and pulled out a small certificate printed on official Portland Police Department letterhead. "This is a Junior Hero Award. It's for people who help the police keep others safe, and you definitely qualify." Emma took the certificate carefully, her small fingers tracing the gold seal at the bottom. "I'm a hero." "You're absolutely a hero," Torres confirmed. "You were brave when it was really hard to be brave. That's what heroes do." Emma studied the certificate for a long moment, then looked up at Torres with an expression far too wise for a 3-year-old. "Bailey's a hero too." "Bailey's definitely a hero too," Torres agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Emma threw her arms around Bailey's neck, burying her face in golden fur. "We're heroes together," she whispered. And in that moment, watching a traumatized child embrace the therapy dog who'd given her the courage to speak, Torres knew that healing was possible. Difficult, slow, non-linear. But absolutely, undeniably possible. 8 months had passed since that September morning when Emma Mitchell had pointed at a therapy dog in a federal courthouse and changed everything. Now, on a warm May afternoon, Sarah and Emma walked hand in hand up those same marble steps, but everything felt different. Emma wore her favorite dress, the new one with golden retrievers printed all over it that she'd picked out specifically for today. At 4 years old now, she was taller, more confident, her curls bouncing as she climbed the steps with purpose rather than fear. She carried a handmade card tucked under her arm, decorated with stickers and careful crayon drawings. "Is Bailey going to be there?" Emma asked for the 3rd time that morning. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, squeezing her daughter's hand. Detective Torres promised Bailey would be there. They weren't alone this time. Behind them came a stream of families, the with Tommy, the Parks with Madison, the with their twins, the with Sophie, the Williams family with 27 families in total, all making their way to courtroom 4B for sentencing hearing. The past 8 months had been a journey none of them could have imagined. There had been countless therapy sessions, forensic interviews, depositions, and preliminary hearings. There had been setbacks and breakthroughs, nightmares and triumphs, tears and laughter. The children had formed bonds with each other, becoming a tight-knit group who understood what the others had been through in ways no one else could. The trial itself had lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence: the physical evidence from the basement, the testimony of child psychologists and trauma experts, the documented pattern of abuse spanning 4 years. 19 of the older children had, including Emma, each one telling their story with Bailey sitting beside them in the witness box. His defense had crumbled quickly. Her lawyer had tried to paint her as an overwhelmed caregiver who'd made poor choices but meant no harm. That argument had died when the prosecution presented evidence that had been taking in extra children specifically for the additional income, sometimes caring for as many as 16 children at once when her license authorized only 6. She'd been making nearly $6,000 a week, all while providing substandard care and terrorizing children into silence. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 38 counts: 27 counts of child endangerment, 7 counts of unlawful imprisonment, 1 count of operating an illegal facility, 2 counts of animal abuse, and 1 count of fraud. Now they'd all returned for the sentencing. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was completely different from that chaotic September day. The gallery was packed with families, victims' advocates, social workers, and media representatives. Detective Torres sat in his usual spot in the 3rd row, and beside him, wearing her official therapy vest, was Bailey. Emma's face lit up the moment she spotted them. "Bailey," she called out, waving enthusiastically. Bailey's tail wagged, and Torres smiled, gesturing for Emma to come over. Sarah followed as Emma rushed to the golden retriever, dropping to her knees for their ritual greeting, Emma hugging Bailey's neck while the dog leaned into the embrace. "Good morning, Emma," Torres said warmly. "Are you ready for today?" Emma nodded seriously. "I made Bailey a card. Want to see?" She opened the handmade card to reveal a drawing of a courthouse with a stick figure girl and a golden dog standing in front of it. In careful, shaky letters, Emma had written with her mother's help, "Thank you, Bailey, for being brave with me. Love, Emma." Torres felt his chest tighten. Over the past 8 months, he'd watched Emma transform from a terrified child who could barely make eye contact into this confident little girl who understood that her bravery had mattered. Bailey had been instrumental in that transformation, attending every therapy session, every court preparation meeting, every moment when Emma needed reassurance that she was safe. "She's going to love it," Torres said, his voice rough with emotion. "Why don't you give it to her after the hearing?" Other children were gathering around Bailey now, a familiar ritual. The golden retriever had become a symbol of safety and healing for all 27 victims. Some families had even gotten their own therapy dogs, inspired by Bailey's impact on their children's recovery. "All rise," the bailiff announced, the honorable judge presiding. Judge entered and took her seat, her expression grave. She'd presided over the entire trial, and Torres knew she'd been deeply affected by the testimony she'd heard. Judges were supposed to remain impartial, but there was no hiding the compassion in her eyes as she looked at the families filling her courtroom. "Please be seated," she said. "We're here today for the sentencing of who has been convicted on 38 counts related to the abuse and endangerment of children under her care." Was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, looking nothing like the cheerful grandmother figure who'd run Little Learners. 8 months in custody had aged her. Her gray hair hung limp, her face was drawn, and she kept her eyes down as she took her seat at the defense table. Judge reviewed the charges and the jury's verdicts, then looked at the prosecution table. "Does the state wish to make a statement before sentencing?" Assistant District Attorney Thornton stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The state wishes to emphasize the severity and systematic nature of these crimes. Mrs. didn't make a mistake or have a momentary lapse in judgment. For at least 4 years, she deliberately terrorized children under her care for personal convenience and financial gain. She used an animal as a weapon of psychological abuse. She taught children that their voices didn't matter, that adults wouldn't believe them, that speaking the truth would lead to punishment. Thornton gestured to the families in the gallery. 27 children, Your Honor. 27 small voices that were silenced by fear. Some of these children were as young as 2 years old. They suffered nightmares, anxiety, regression in development, and profound trauma, all while their parents trusted Mrs. to keep them safe. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But there's another side to this story, the story of resilience. The story of one brave 3-year-old girl who saw a therapy dog in this very courtroom and found the courage to break her silence. Emma Mitchell's bravery gave voice to 26 other children. It exposed a pattern of abuse that might have continued for years. It led to significant reforms in our state's oversight system. Thornton turned slightly to acknowledge the families. These children are healing. They're learning to trust again, to feel safe again, to understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault. But that healing has required intensive therapy, medical treatment, and ongoing support. Some of these children will carry the scars of Mrs.'s abuse for the rest of their lives. The state recommends the maximum sentence on all counts to be served consecutively. We ask this not for vengeance, but for justice, for accountability, and to send a clear message that those who harm children will face serious consequences. Judge nodded and turned to the defense table. Does the defense wish to speak? His lawyer stood reluctantly. He'd long since abandoned any pretense that his client was innocent, now focusing solely on mitigation. Your Honor, Mrs. is 67 years old. She has no prior criminal record. She's a grandmother herself. We ask the court to consider her age and health when determining an appropriate sentence. Consecutive sentences would effectively be a life sentence for a woman of her age. Is Mrs. prepared to make a statement? Judge asked. Stood slowly, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just trying to manage too many children and I made poor choices. I'm sorry. Judge's expression hardened. Mrs., you didn't make poor choices. You engaged in systematic abuse of vulnerable children for financial gain. You weaponized their natural fears. You betrayed the trust of families who believed you cared for their children. You showed no remorse throughout this trial, and your apology now rings hollow. The judge looked down at her notes, then back up at the courtroom. Before I pronounce sentence, I'd like to address the families here today. What your children endured was unconscionable, but I want you to know that their courage in coming forward, in testifying, in telling their truth, that courage has made a difference. Because of these brave children, Oregon has passed the Childhood Safety Act, requiring cameras in all licensed facilities, mandatory unannounced inspections, stricter background checks, and expanded training for providers. Judge paused, her gaze sweeping across the families. Because of Emma Mitchell and the 26 other children who found their voices, countless future children will be better protected. That is your children's legacy, not the trauma they endured, but the change they inspired. Torres watched Emma, listening intently, not fully understanding all the legal language, but grasping that the judge was saying something important about her and her friends. Judge continued, her voice taking on a formal gravity. You have been convicted of 38 counts of crimes against children. I've reviewed the evidence, the victim impact statements, and the recommendations from both prosecution and defense. These crimes were not momentary lapses in judgment. They were calculated, repeated, and devastating. She listed each count and its corresponding sentence, the numbers adding up rapidly. Child endangerment, 5 years per count for the most severe cases. Unlawful imprisonment, 3 years per count. Operating an illegal facility, 2 years. Animal abuse, 1 year per count. Fraud, 2 years. These sentences will run consecutively, Judge concluded. You are hereby sentenced to a total of 147 years in the Oregon State Correctional System. A murmur ran through the courtroom. His face went white, and she gripped the defense table for support. Her lawyer put a steadying hand on her shoulder. You will be eligible for parole review after serving a minimum of 40 years, the judge added. But given your age, this is effectively a life sentence. You will spend the rest of your days in prison, which seems a fitting consequence for someone who imprisoned children in darkness and fear. As the bailiffs led from the courtroom, her legs barely supporting her, the families in the gallery sat in stunned silence. Then slowly, quietly, someone began to clap. It was Maria, Isabella's mother. Others joined in, a wave of applause that wasn't celebratory but cathartic, a collective acknowledgement that justice had been served. After the courtroom cleared, Torres brought the families together in a private conference room the court had set aside. Emma immediately went to Bailey, presenting her handmade card with great ceremony. "This is for you, Bailey," she announced, "for being the best doggy and the best friend." Torres opened the card on Bailey's behalf, reading it aloud. Several parents wiped away tears. "Actually," Torres said, clearing his throat, "I have some news to share. Bailey and I have been working together for 3 years now, and she's earned a well-deserved retirement from active courthouse duty." Emma's face fell. "Bailey's leaving." "Not exactly," Torres said, smiling. "Bailey's going to retire from full-time work, but she'll still do special visits and therapy sessions. The thing is, therapy dogs need loving homes when they retire, and Bailey has made it very clear who she'd like to live with." He looked directly at Emma and Sarah. "Mrs. Mitchell, Emma, Bailey would like to retire to your family, if you'll have her." Emma's scream of joy could probably be heard 3 floors down. She threw herself at Bailey, and the dog's tail wagged so hard her entire back end wiggled. Sarah burst into tears, nodding her agreement while Emma chanted, "Bailey's coming home, Bailey's coming home." Torres knelt beside Emma. "You'll need to take very good care of her. She's not a working dog anymore. She's just going to be your friend and companion." "I'll take the best care ever," Emma promised solemnly. "We'll go on walks and play fetch, and she can sleep in my room, and I'll brush her every day." As the families gathered to say their goodbyes and take photos together, the children clustered around Bailey one last time in her official capacity. Torres reflected on the journey they'd all taken. From that terrifying moment when Emma had pointed in fear to this moment of joy and justice. Would spend the rest of her life in prison. 27 children were healing, supported by therapy and love, and the knowledge that their voices had mattered. Reforms had been passed that would protect countless future children. And Bailey, the gentle golden retriever who'd been at the center of it all, was going home with the little girl who'd started everything. Sarah approached Torres as Emma played with Bailey. "How can I ever thank you?" "You don't need to thank me," Torres said. "Emma's courage did this. You believed her and supported her. That's all any child needs, someone who listens, who believes, who acts." Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine warmed the Portland streets. Emma held Bailey's leash in one hand and her mother's hand in the other, chattering excitedly about all the things she and Bailey would do together. 27 families walked away from that courthouse, carrying the weight of justice served and the lightness of healing begun. Children who'd learned to cry quietly had learned to laugh loudly again. Children who'd been taught their voices didn't matter had discovered they could change the world. And it had all started with one pointed finger, one moment of recognition, one therapy dog who knew exactly how to help a scared little girl feel safe enough to tell the truth. Emma looked back at the courthouse one final time, then smiled up at her mother. "Mommy, can we go to the park? I want to teach Bailey to play on the swings." Sarah laughed through happy tears. "Sweetheart, I don't think dogs can swing." "Bailey can do anything," Emma said with absolute certainty. And watching her daughter skip down the courthouse steps with her new best friend, Sarah believed it might just be true. Everything had changed, indeed. And it had changed for the better. The end.